Welcome back to the deep dive. This time, we're heading down to Texas for a case that's been haunting Odessa for over 3 decades. We got an episode of Crime Junkie from a listener about the murder of Deborah Sue Moore, and gosh, it's a real head scratcher.
Yeah, it's a crazy case. There are so many twists and turns, almost like a spider web of potential suspects and so many missed opportunities, all centered around this young mother who was brutally murdered right outside of her apartment.
It's just chilling. So let's set the scene for our listeners. It's May 17th, 1986. It's just before 3 a.m. Odessa is sound asleep, but over at the Viva apartments, a real nightmare is about to unfold. Witnesses said they heard a scream in the night, followed by some kind of struggle, and then silence. One neighbor, Dale, found Deborah lying in a pool of blood right outside her apartment door. She had an overnight bag by her side. Her life was tragically cut short.
The crime scene photos are really disturbing to look at. You see this young woman, a mother of two, who is just trying to get her life back on track, and then it's all ripped away from her in a flash of violence.
The brutality of the attack really stands out, too. Deborah was stabbed multiple times. It's just so clear that this wasn't random. Whoever did this was full of rage. But that's not the only strange thing about this scene, right? There's a blood trail, which you would expect leading back towards her apartment door, like she may have tried to get back inside. But then there's another set of bloody footprints leading away from the scene.
That's what's so confusing about this case. Whose footprints are those? Did the killer get injured when they were attacking her? Was there maybe another witness who just ran away? The police reports we have don't really give us a clear answer.
It's frustrating, right? It's like a big piece of the puzzle is missing. And of course, this was 1986, so DNA technology wasn't what it is today. The police were really relying on fingerprints, witness statements,
Yeah.
good old-fashioned detective work. And from the very beginning, their attention turned to Deborah's estranged husband, Tim Moore.
Tim is a very interesting character in all of this. Because on the one hand, so many people are describing him as violent and abusive towards Deborah. Her friend, Curtis, told the police about a time that Tim beat Deborah so badly she had to go to the hospital.
It's just awful to think about what she had to go through. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. Deborah's ex-boyfriend, Jimmy, actually even told police that she was scared that Tim would kill her if she tried to leave him.
Her fear was definitely real, and we see that in the police reports, too. Tim even admitted to hurting Deborah on a couple of separate occasions. It's a very dark picture of what their relationship was like.
So Tim is obviously a big suspect for the police. But he denied having anything to do with Deborah's murder. He said that he was at his trucking company the whole night, and he even passed a polygraph test.
But here's the thing about polygraph tests, they're not perfect. And the detective who's now in charge of the case, Detective Gonzalez, has said that the detectives who worked on the case originally didn't ask Tim some really important questions, like, did he know who killed Deborah? Or did he hire someone to do it?
Oh, wow. Those are big things they missed. And unfortunately, Tim died a few years ago, so any answers he might have had died with him.
It's like a dead end that's just hanging over the whole case. Even if Tim wasn't directly involved, he may have taken some important information to his grave with him.
Okay, so the police are looking into Tim, and then another call comes in, and this is where it gets even more interesting. Just a few minutes after Deborah was killed, there was an attempted abduction at a 7-Eleven just down the road from the Viva apartments. And the suspect description that they got sounds a lot like the person witnesses saw at the crime scene. Someone with a slim build and brown hair about shoulder length.
It's such a scary coincidence. The police arrested the suspect, David Good, very quickly. And here's where it gets even creepier. He admitted that he wanted to rape and murder the clerk at the 7-Eleven.
Wow, okay. So now we have two potential suspects. Both of them have a history of violence against women. It's getting complicated.
Hold on, though, because there are also some things that don't quite add up. The timeline is so tight. Is it really possible David could have done both of these crimes? Plus, the clerk at the 7-Eleven didn't say that she saw any blood on him, and you'd think there would be blood if he had just stabbed someone multiple times.
So the police have to ask themselves, was it Tim, the estranged husband with a violent past? Or was it David, who admitted he tried to abduct someone and who seemed to want to hurt women? Or could it have been someone else completely?
That's the question that has been haunting this case for decades. And as the investigators kept digging, they found a really disturbing trend. It turns out that there were a few other attacks on women that happened around the same time in that area.
Wait a minute, are we saying there could have been a serial predator operating in Odessa at that time?
It's something that they had to consider. There was a sexual assault against a college student just a few days before Deborah was murdered, and the description of the attacker is similar. And then you've got the incident at that auto body shop where a woman was attacked.
And didn't David Good have some connection to that auto body shop?
Yeah, you're right. His former partner worked there, and she told the police that David had attacked her at the shop before. It's a weird coincidence.
So we have Tim, the violent husband. We have David, who admitted to trying to abduct someone, and he might be connected to other attacks. Who else did the police have on their radar?
Get ready for this one. The police were also looking into Deborah's ex-boyfriend, who was apparently stalking her. They thought about a man who had recently been charged with attacking a woman in a town nearby. They even looked at a man who was always hanging around the Viva apartments and kept getting kicked off the property. And then they even considered a revenge plot, maybe connected to Deborah's brother, who was in prison at the time for rape.
It sounds like everyone in Deborah's life was potentially dangerous to women.
Yeah.
That is terrifying.
Yeah, and it reminds you how vulnerable women were back then, and sadly, how vulnerable they still are today.
But wait, there's more to this. We are about to share a piece of information that was never even given to the police, and this could change everything. Deborah's sister, Jana, had a phone call with Deborah late at night, just a few days before the murder. Deborah told Jana about this man named Frank, and then the call just ended right after someone knocked on her door.
This is what's so crazy about cold cases, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes one little overlooked detail can change the entire course of the investigation.
And the police never even knew about Frank. Jana later asked him about Frank, and his reaction sounded more like he was jealous than actually concerned. So who is this mysterious Frank? Why was his name never even mentioned in the police reports?
It makes you wonder if the police were so focused on Tim and David that they just missed other possibilities. It happens a lot in investigations, that kind of tunnel vision.
And then, to make things even more complicated, there are Deborah's children, Bert and Brandy. They were really young when she was murdered, but they still have vivid memories of Tim's abuse.
Their stories are truly heartbreaking. Bert says he remembers hiding under the table with his mother whenever Tim got angry. Brandy remembers how scared they were and how her mother ended up sending her to live with her father to keep her safe.
It's hard to even imagine what they went through. They lost their mother in such a terrible way, and then on top of that, they have to live with not knowing who did it. It's just unimaginable.
Their stories are a really important reminder that with every true crime case, there are actual people whose lives are completely changed by these tragedies.
And they lived with that uncertainty for so many years. But recently, Detective Gonzalez started taking another look at the case, and she's looking at new evidence, including the possibility of doing some DNA testing. Could this finally bring Deborah's family the answers they've been looking for all this time?
We'll talk more about that after a quick break. Stay with us.
We're back, and I gotta say, I'm really intrigued by this DNA angle. You mentioned Detective Gonzalez is looking into that. What kind of evidence are we actually talking about here?
Well, back in '86, DNA technology was just getting started. It wasn't really a thing. But the good news is the investigators collected a sexual assault kit when they did Deborah's autopsy, and that included fingernail clippings.
Oh, right, and because witnesses said that Deborah was fighting back against her attacker, she could have scratched him, right? And that would have left his DNA under her nails.
Exactly. That's what Detective Gonzalez is hoping for. It's a long shot, but if they can get a good DNA profile from those clippings, they might finally be able to figure out who the killer is.
Man, that would be amazing to solve this after all these years. What are the chances they'll actually find any usable DNA after so long?
Well, it really depends on how they stored the evidence, what the environment was like, even if the samples were exposed to sunlight, stuff like that. But with the technology they have now, even a tiny amount of DNA, even if it's degraded, can be enough to get a profile.
Okay, so let's say they do get a profile. How would they compare it? I mean, they don't have everyone's DNA from back then in some giant database, do they?
No, you're right. Back then, DNA databases were basically non-existent, but they do have a blood sample from David Good, the guy who tried to kidnap that woman at the 7-Eleven.
So if the DNA they find under Deborah's nails matches David Good's DNA, that's basically it, right? Case closed.
Yeah, it would pretty much make him the prime suspect.
Yeah.
But Detective Gonzalez is trying to be thorough. She wants to get a DNA sample from Charles Zell, too. He's the guy Deborah was with that night, just to be absolutely sure he's ruled out.
Makes sense. They need to make sure the DNA they find doesn't belong to someone who just happened to be there, right?
Exactly. And Detective Gonzalez isn't just focused on the DNA. She's going back and talking to witnesses again, trying to track down Deborah's old friends, basically chasing every lead that comes up.
So it's almost like she's putting together a giant puzzle, right? Except this puzzle is decades old, and she's finding one tiny piece at a time.
And you never know, any one of those pieces could be the key to solving the whole thing. Remember that phone call Deborah had with her sister? The one where she mentioned the guy named Frank? Detective Gonzalez is trying to find out anything she can about him.
It's just unbelievable to me that nobody followed up on that Frank lead back then. Is there any chance they'll find him after all this time?
It'll be tough, but it's not impossible. People move, they change their names, they disappear. But there's always something, digital footprints, social media connections, things like that.
Maybe someone listening right now remembers something. A friend of Deborah's, someone who knew Tim back then. At this point, any detail could be helpful. What are some other loose ends Detective Gonzalez is looking at?
Remember Tim said that Deborah was having problems with Bert's stepmom? It doesn't sound like the investigators from back then looked into that very much.
And Deborah's kids also said that their mom was having issues with this guy who was following her.
So you have to consider that maybe someone who didn't like Deborah, someone who knew her routines, could have been the one who did it.
That's a really scary thought. And it makes you realize how many people could have been involved in this.
It reminds you that sometimes the truth is right there in front of you, just hidden in plain sight. You just have to look at things from a new angle, Be willing to dig a little deeper.
And that seems to be exactly what Detective Gonzalez is doing. She's not letting these old case files just sit there and collect dust. She's actually trying to get justice for Deborah and her family.
It's really impressive, and it gives me hope that even after all these years, we might actually find out the truth.
I think we all need some hope in a case like this.
Oh, absolutely. It's what keeps us going, It drives us to keep searching, to keep asking questions, to keep fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves.
That's a good way to put it. But before we get too optimistic, we can't forget the human cost of all of this. Deborah was a young mother, and she was just trying to rebuild her life when it was all taken away from her, just like that.
And her kids, Bert and Brandy, they've had to carry the weight of this loss, this mystery, with them their whole lives. Their interviews are so tough to listen to.
Yeah, especially Bert's story, how he used to hide under the table with his mom when Tim would get violent. You could just hear the fear and helplessness in his voice.
And Brandy, she just wants to be able to tell her own kids what happened to their grandmother. It's really moving.
It reminds us that these aren't just stories, These are real people whose lives were completely shattered by this crime.
And that's why we have to keep telling these stories, to keep asking questions, and to keep fighting for justice. It doesn't matter how much time has passed.
You're absolutely right. So as we move into the final part of our deep dive today, let's think about what we've learned so far and see if we can start to put together some possible answers to this mystery that's been going on for decades. It's really unsettling to think that the person who killed Deborah might still be out there, maybe even living a normal life after all these years.
Yeah, it's a scary thought, and it just shows how important it is to be aware and keep these cases in the public eye. We can't let them be forgotten. Everyone deserves justice. It doesn't matter how long it's been.
Deborah's story really highlights the dangers of domestic violence. It often starts small, almost unnoticeable, and then gets worse over time until the victim feels trapped and powerless.
That's right. And it's not just the immediate victim who's affected. Deborah's kids saw their mother being abused, and then they lost her in such a horrible way. They've had to deal with that trauma their whole lives.
It's just heartbreaking. Bert's story especially is just so powerful. Losing both of his parents in such traumatic ways led to a real fear of abandonment. And it's a reminder of the damage that violence can cause.
And Brandy, she just wants to find some kind of closure so she can tell her own kids what happened to their grandmother. That's really touching.
They both deserve answers, that's for sure. It's easy to get caught up in the details of the investigation, the evidence, the suspects, but we have to remember that Deborah was a real person. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, a mother. And she loved to sing and make people laugh.
Right. She had hopes and dreams, a whole life ahead of her, and it was all taken away. We have to keep looking for the truth for her.
You're right. And that's why what Detective Gonzalez is doing is so important. It's not just about solving a cold case. It's about justice for Deborah and granting her family some peace.
And, maybe by sharing Deborah's story, someone listening might remember something. Even a small detail could help Detective Gonzalez solve this case.
I hope so. Even the smallest piece of information could be the missing link. So if you know anything at all about Deborah's case, anything at all, please get in touch with Detective Gonzalez. Her contact info is on our website.
And if you or someone you know is in a situation with domestic violence, remember you're not alone. There are resources available to help. We'll put some links on our website, too.
This deep dive has been tough, but I think it's been really important to tell this story and to shed light on violence against women. Deborah Sue Moore deserves justice, and her family deserves to know what happened.
Absolutely. We honor Deborah and all victims of violence by keeping their memory alive, by continuing to ask questions, and by demanding answers.
That's a great way to put it. And as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with this thought. If you see something that seems off, or if you know something about a crime, even if it happened a long time ago, don't be afraid to speak up. What you know could make all the difference.
And never lose hope. Even in the most difficult cases, there's always a chance for justice.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating stories. See you next time.